I think virtually all of you know who I am, and many of you have seen my two recent experiences, but here talking to this group, but just in a couple of sentences, if there's anyone who doesn't know, my professional career was in the foreign affairs field and spent about 30 years as a foreign service officer, both with the Department of State for an initial tour and then with the CIA for most of my time, serving both at home and abroad. And when I retired from that in 1992, I came down here to teach at VMI and taught in the International Studies Department for 28 years before stepping down about a year ago and still doing some small things around the edges. So as a professional, insofar as I was one, my field was foreign affairs and politics. That's not what I'm talking about today. I have another string to my bow. And all of you, some of you were here when I did Ukraine about a month ago, and the Russian and Ukrainian investments at various positions there. In the fall, I contributed one session in a 3-session thing we did on the prophets of ancient Israel, and I did the one on historical background. And that string to my bow, as many of you also know, derived originally from a year I spent at the Harvard Divinity School when I first got out of college. And that was kind of an experimental year that was paid for by the Danforth Foundation, and it never turned into anything vocationally, but it generated a lifelong avocational interest that I've had in religious studies in general, and particularly in biblical studies, and particularly in the study of ancient Israel and the Old Testament. And that's the string that's on my bow this morning, as it was in the fall. And I'm going to be talking in a series here about 3 kings of ancient Israel, David, Solomon, and Josiah, who exemplify 3 important periods and aspects of the development of monarchy in ancient Israel. And today it'll be David. Just as a little more prologue, well, I have 3 strings to my bow. The 3rd one is the Boston Red Sox. Some of you may have heard of them. Occasionally they appear on TV here. Any of you ever heard of or know about Louis Tiant? There was a pitcher of the Boston Red Sox. Louis Tiant was famous for having about a 45-second windup, followed by a blazingly fast pitch when he finally got around to it. And he went through all sorts of contortions in the windup. And I'm often, when I'm making presentations like this, in danger of being Louis Tiant, because I get involved in the windup, and then I look at the clock and I said, well, I only got 5 minutes left if I don't look at the pitch. So I'm going to try to do a little better than that this time. I welcome comments and questions at any time that you can attract my attention. I probably will have a tendency to go on automatic pilot and go, brrr, but I don't mind being interrupted. I like it, but you have to do it. How many of you knew Elise Sprott here? Any of you?
Oh, yes.
Elise Sprott. Yeah, Elise was here when I first came, and she helped introduce me around. When she used to introduce me, her standard thing was, "This is Doug, you have to interrupt him." Okay? And that is an idea I leave with you as we begin, because I love to be interrupted. I just don't help you much in interrupting me, because I can go for a long time without thinking about it. As I say, we're going to be dealing with 3 kings in this series, with David, with Solomon, and with Josiah, each of them exemplifying a different aspect of the development of monarchy in ancient as part of the Louis Tian wind-up, I would sort of say in the beginning that in the history of ancient Israel, I think David probably ranks second only to Moses in terms of his significance. And quite arguably, he might rank ahead of Moses in terms of the way he has captured the popular imagination. In preparing for this presentation, many of the people I've talked to have said, oh, David is our favorite character in the Old Testament. I'm not sure he's my favorite, and we can deal with that in a little while. But he certainly has a charisma that has been projected not only on ancient Israel, but on modern Israel, and in fact, on the modern Christian West. David is probably the most prevalent in the modern Christian West, if you want to put it that way, biblical Old Testament surname among all of them, whether among Jews or Gentiles, ranging from David Ben-Gurion at the very beginning of the founding of the modern state of Israel, to David Ortiz. Some of you people will recognize him as belonging to my third primary interest in life. And he has captured imagination. Moses, I think, can be seen as the founder of Israel's nationhood, the founder of Israel's, a couple of terms, back to Louis Tian's wind-up, a couple of terms I have to clarify. We often use the word nation, country, and state as synonyms in popular language. In political science, they mean distinct things. A country is a geographical expression, identifiable through conventional usage. A nation is a group of people who believe they belong together. And many times, other people outside believe they belong together too. But it's a group of people with a certain affinity binding them. And a state is a legal personality which expresses itself most usually in government. Not identical to government, it's a broader concept for a legal personality. Well, in any case, one can see Moses, I think, as the founder of Israel's nationality. Through the Exodus, through the Sinai events, through the wanderings in the wilderness, through the preparations for the conquest. David is a different founder, and David, I think, can be seen as the founder of Israel's monarchical system. He's not the first king, we'll deal with that in a moment, but he is really the founder of the institution of monarchy in ancient Israel. We need to begin, and over on the far side, I've got, my nickel history of the evolution of Israel from the Exodus through the Exile, with key points noted. We need to begin with putting David in his broader historical context. If you look at that little schema there, you'll notice that I have an entry covering roughly 2 centuries after the conquest that is characterized as a period of a tribal confederation. The technical term, among those of us who had 1 year of divinity studies, is amphictyony.
What was that?
Yeah. You want to maybe say it twice. Amphictyony. And I can even spell it if necessary. It's a little hard to pronounce and even harder to spell, but it is the scholar's word for the Tribal Confederation. And there have been in history a number of tribal confederations. The ancient Greeks during one period were a tribal confederation or a city-state confederation. It denotes kind of a loose association related people, but not necessarily centrally governed.
That's what we fought the British under.
It's what we fought them under and continued to struggle with after we had, with a little assistance from the French, defeated them, and under what we called the Articles of Confederation. In a way, we were talking about a tribal conflict, not quite what Israel meant during the period of the judges. But it's important to start there because really David completes the transition from the Amphictyony to the normative monarchy in Israel, which then ruled Israel in a united monarchy or a divided monarchy down to the time of the exile, was in some measure restored after the return, though not quite the same way, and has figured in the religious imagination in the Judeo-Christian tradition in a couple of ways, because on the one hand, it gave rise to the idea of the divine right of kings in one form or another, and that the king's relationship to God was a source of his authority, something that was a prevalent idea right down through the 19th century. But it also contributed to the idea of God as king. So monarchy influenced in two different ways, the way we thought about God and the way we thought about Israel and its governance. There was, under the tribal Amphictyony, no single unified state. Nominally, there were 12 tribes. When you start to look into them in detail, you wonder whether the number is correct and whether the locations are correct. But for tradition's sake, we'll talk about the tribal Amphictyony of 12 tribes. No unified state. In normal times, the tribal leaders, the tribal elders, ran the affairs of the various tribes with not an awful lot of coordination. There was a sense of nationhood dating back to the pre-communist times. There was a sense of who the people of Israel were, but in practical political terms, this was a very loose kind of form of government. In times of national emergency, the leaders of the various tribes, sometimes all of them, sometimes a group of them, got together to recognize an overall leader for the period of the emergency. These people were styled the judges. And you don't want to think of the judges primarily as a judicial figure, although they did exercise some judicial functions. But primarily, they were political figures ruling in a period of national emergency, coordinating the activities of a group of tribes, sometimes a few, sometimes most or all of them. For the duration of the emergency, they were kind of like martial law leaders.
Or Cincinnati.
Yes. What tribe was he in? That was the Red Lakes.
But it's the concept.
Red Lakes.
It's the concept of that.
Yeah. Yes, it was. It certainly was emergent during a period of emergency. And these were charismatic figures, whatever that means. That means someone who captures the imagination through largely personal qualities and personal experience, captures the imagination of the people who choose to follow. And the judges then were primarily people who had this kind of authority. They were charismatic figures. They came like Cincinnatus out of nowhere and then went on to inspire cadets at BMI.
And they were a very mixed moral character.
The judges,
No,
I was
absolutely.
gonna say not being
And the
high.
kings.
Yeah, well, yes.
But the judges.
Yeah, we're not, and I'm not going to deal with an awful lot of the judges at this point, only to note that they sometimes were female.
Yes,
And one of the most famous ever was a female.
one of the most competent ones.
And well, yeah, and most of the judges within that framework were competent. Most of them had been war heroes in one sense or another. None of them established a dynasty. When they disappeared, they disappeared. They may have established a tradition, but not a dynasty, or any continuing framework of governance above the tribal level. They came and they went as the situation required. And for a couple hundred years, you can see what I've listed over there as a period of the tribal antiquity. This seemed to be adequate, largely because there was not an overwhelming foreign threat. The half century, really, before the year 1000, the Tribal Confederation progressively became inadequate, and the transition to monarchy began. And the impetus was an external threat. It was the Philistines. And on this map, procured at great expense from local artists, you'll note here along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, an area that went by different names and gave its name to Palestine eventually, but was settled by the Philistines. The Philistines, near as one can tell, were also known as the Sea Peoples. They were probably of Greek origin originally, but then began to migrate into other areas. They were maybe partly pirates, okay, in the beginning. And they settled down primarily in 5 cities along the coast here, as well as being still present in Egypt and in other places. The Philistines were a warrior people, and once they got settled, they created considerable difficulties for the Israelite tribes. They were the stimulus for this period of transition. They were the external threat, if you will. The monarchy was the response to this external threat. It was the way the tribal antiquity transformed itself to deal with the Philistine threat. And I think consolidation in basic form could be thought of as what the monarchy did, consolidating authority to meet the external threat. Now, analogies are dangerous, and we already indulged in one of them when we talked about the Articles of the Confederation and the American experience. You know, don't translate these too literally. They're just a way of illustrating by looking at a different period and a different experience what some of this means. There were 2 figures who played key roles in this period of transition in the 50 years, particularly before the year 1000. And they were Samuel, whom we could describe as the reluctant kingmaker, perhaps, and Saul, the first king, whom I have described in my notes and maybe on that chart, I don't know, as a one-dimensional king. Samuel, in the first mentions we find of him in the Old Testament, could be more accurately described as a seer, a person who sees things other people don't see. And some of the seers, and they were around for a couple of hundred years preceding this period, were guns for hire. You could go to a seer and you could say, as one of the stories the origin of kingship talks about, I've lost my donkeys. Can you help me find them? And he said, you know, for 25 shekels, I'll tell you where they were last seen. That was a seer, not primarily an ethical figure, But during this period, and certainly we see it in the career of Samuel, the seer is transformed into a prophet who sees things for a public purpose. And in Samuel's case, this gets very mixed up with the origins of Israel's monarchy. We were talking earlier about the fact that there are at least 3 distinct stories about how Samuel came to choose Saul to be the first king of Israel. They don't necessarily fit together. One of them sees him as a charismatic warrior. There are 3, and I get too far. I'm too much like Louis Tion if I get into these things, too much wind up and down. But in any case, we find Samuel being transformed to a public commentator, a prophet, and then somewhat reluctantly into a kingmaker. And in fact, he anoints both Saul and David later in his first anointing as king. And he does so in most of the biblical narrative, although there's some differences in it, somewhat reluctantly. And at one point he has an argument with God when they're talking about anointing Saul. He's saying sort of to God, you know, do you really want to do this? Have you thought this through? You know what this could bring us in the end? And this is a strain that continues even in the period of monarchy. This is a critique that's levied, for instance, against Solomon later on. That Solomon is scourging the people with heavier whips than David did even, you know, and did you make a mistake? And underlying this whole theory of monarchy, there's a subtext, a minority subtext, that kind of says, was this really a good idea? And that is to be seen in Samuel's debates with himself, which in the Old Testament are usually described as debates with God. The ancient Jews, or the ancient Israelites, are great negotiators. And an awful lot of what you see are their discussions with God, saying, do you really understand what you're doing here? It seems to me if I were running the universe, I'd do it a little differently. Now, God tends to win in the end. See this in the book of Job, but not until we've gone through a period where God basically has to say to him, come on, where were you when I created the earth? You know, listen to me. Don't go by what you think is a good idea. Well, that's another thing for another time. I preached on that once years ago here. There may be a few of you who were present during it. It enraged our bishop because, no, it didn't.
Were you saying the bishop was here when you were
He was here, yeah. Not enraged, engaged. I used the wrong word. My interpretation of the book of Job was not exactly the classic simple-minded interpretation the church tends to endorse. Okay. Philistine threat consolidation as the response to key figures. Samuel transformed from seer to prophet to kingmaker, and Saul the first king. And there are, as I said, various stories about why Saul was selected. I've described Saul as a one-dimensional king. I would describe David as the first real king and the founder of the institution of monarchy. Saul became king by accident in a way, by being a war hero, and then in the immediate aftermath, there being no real alternative to him. But it's important to note that Saul did not establish a continuing institution of monarchy. Saul did not create a dynasty. Saul had heirs, but none of them inherited the kingdom. David did, okay? And so when you think of institutional creation, Saul had more in common with the judges than he had with David and the later monarch. He arose to meet an emergency. He couldn't sustain power. He tried to, in contrast to the judges, but couldn't sustain power. And he disappeared. And we'll talk about how he disappeared in a minute. And it was David who completed that transition to monarchy as a permanent institution in ancient Israel for a period, or at least as a durable institution. Okay, turning to David. The first heading that I put in my outline was David as man and myth. And unquestionably, David is an extraordinary figure. And he's got a number of positive personal characteristics. He has charismatic leadership quality. He's a larger than life figure. We know him, however, most reliably by the qualities that he displays after he becomes king. I'll mention some of the childhood or youthful David stories and why some of them may be questionable. The qualities he exhibited as king are well known and well documented and in the public record. He was ambitious, no question about it. He had to pretend sometimes he wasn't. This was the old problem, I guess. And Caesar was ambitious. Well, there was a little bit of that in David. He was highly capable in a variety of ways. He was visionary. He was decisive. He was courageous. He was resolute. He had a warrior background. I'll deal with that a little bit in a minute or two. He was often charming. He inspired really devoted loyalty among his followers. He had undoubted artistic talents. He was clearly musical. There's some doubt about just how musical. And he had literary talents, and there's some doubt about what he did and didn't write. But he had other qualities too. He was a hot-tempered redhead. I don't know why that strikes me as being important, but he is described as being a redhead, and it's usually depicted as a redhead. And redheads are thought to have certain personality characteristics sometimes. Some of my relatives have red hair. And he was sometimes immoderate. And he could also be, and I'm going to illustrate in specific ways in his policy some of these characteristics, just to sketch them out. He could also be vindictive. He was a polygamist. Good thing or bad thing? It was not prohibited by the customs of Israel during the period when he was indulged in polygamy, both simultaneous polygamy and serial polygamy. Okay, and we'll talk at the end a little bit about his family relationships and some of the complications they induced. But it was not regarded as prohibited, particularly not for influential people, and later on, particularly not for national leaders. We'll talk more about his wives and children later on, about something I described as the politics of the harem. He was an adulterer, not just once, most famously with Bathsheba, before her husband was eliminated and before he married him, he married her. But he was an adulterer on other occasions too that are documented. He was a covetous conniver in the Bathsheba affair, as I'll mention in more detail later. He arranged the murder of Bathsheba's husband in order to be able to marry her after already having had an adulterous relationship with her. He was at least an accessory to the murder of two of his sons, Absalom and Adonijah. We'll talk about that in a little more detail later. As an old man, he took comfort, not necessarily more specifically described, in the company of adolescent girls who were described as providing him with warmth when he had the chills in bed or something.
Every old man's fantasy.
Every old man's fantasy. And he was a fantasist as well. Whatever those faults were, in the minds of some people, they probably enhanced his charisma. I think some people who feel that way about it happen to be members of the clergy. As a good friend of mine, Dave Brosnan, who some of you may know, a retired Methodist clergyman, one of his favorite expressions when he comes across something that he thinks is inspirational, he says, "That'll preach." Clergy have a tendency to think of many things in terms of, will it preach? And David's faults, David as the imperfect vessel whom God uses to accomplish great things, is preachable, whatever else it might be. Some of his achievements with which he's credited are exaggerated at best, and some are probably fictional. And they're the product of myth-making by his apologists. David, by and large, enjoyed the support of the public, but there were others who were less enthusiastic even after he became king and had demonstrated success. This business of the myth, I think you can perhaps think of Parson Weems. You know, Parson Weems, myth maker for George Washington, another father of his country in a sense, as David was. Very different personality, totally different personality, but who was subject to myth making. And so we had a George Washington who threw silver dollars across the Delaware River.
Potomac.
No, the Delaware, wasn't it?
Crossing the Delaware.
He crossed.
Okay, throw the silver dollars in. It's easier at that place to throw it across Potomac than it is across.
That Potomac's pretty wide.
Yeah, but the Delaware is wide.
It depends on when the tide.
It's stormy. Okay, we'll leave that aside for the moment. I'll let Louis deal with it when he comes back. And then there was the story about his chopping down the cherry tree.
Of course, Washington had a home out in West Virginia where the Potomac might be managed.
Yeah, and obviously was derived from his profession as a surveyor. He was a major landowner, mostly in the West, but in other places as well. If you think of Parson Weems and George Washington, one of the uncertain stories, I'll leave it at that, about young David is his encounter with the giant Goliath. Just as I wasn't going to tell you whether in fact Vladimir Putin intended to actually invade Ukraine or not, so I'm not going to tell you definitely whether the story of David and Goliath is historical. I would mention, however, that in the Old Testament, it's part of a double. There is another story about a hero slaying a Philistine giant. And many scholars have speculated as to whether this earlier event was imported into the David narrative. Okay. I'll just leave it at that.
I've done a musical about that. I've done a musical about that. It's got to be true.
Well, there's many musicals about David, including that he wrote the Psalms, which he did,
Yeah.
So, that's also part of it. He did not, as long as I'm talking about it, compose the book of Psalms. Some of the Psalms are registered under the heading Psalms of David. That is an honorific bestowed upon him. He was certainly a talented musician. He may have written Psalms, probably none in their current form, but possibly a few. But not all the kinds of things that are called the Psalms of David, and certainly not the book of Psalms. Most likely only a limited number of its constituent parts, and perhaps none in their present form. His relationship in earlier years with Saul and Jonathan may have some basis in fact, but it's also a little bit like the stories that are told in the Boy Scouts sometimes about the virtues of friendship. It was probably embellished for political reasons, as we'll explore in more detail later on. So there's myth as well as man, but for all of that, it's unquestionable he had a magnetic personality. He had an impressive record of achievement as a king. He established a united monarchy, which endured through the reign of his son Solomon. He established a Davidic dynasty, which persisted even after the collapse of the United Monarchy. And he also left behind in that connection a legacy, kind of a variation on the Davidic dynasty, a legacy of messianic hope. And when the Gospel of Matthew traces the ancestry of Jesus, he traces it through the paternal line back to David. Okay. David coming to power. David's got a dilemma. At some point during the latter part, probably of Saul's reign, David concludes that Saul and his dynasty are at dead end. They have no future. He is not of kingly stature, and he is not a worthy founder of a dynasty for a family that will continue to rule after he disappears. But David doesn't exactly want to say that exactly, for both practical and ideological reasons. Because although his objective is to discredit Saul and discredit the possibility of Saul being succeeded by a dynasty, he doesn't want to be seen as a usurper. And this is a very strong characteristic in the strategy he employs. Why not? Because David, like Caesar, is ambitious. David wants to be king. And David wants to come into a kingship that has an established ideology that reinforces the kingship. So the purpose of David's campaign against Saul in Saul's later years is to discredit Saul, but not to allow himself to be seen as an enemy of monarchy as an institution. Okay. Now that's kind of a tricky act. He adopts a strategy to kind of make possible those two things, discrediting Saul, but not damaging the monarchy as an institution. Criticizing Saul's shortcomings, but not actively working to overthrow or undermine the institution of kingship. Don't raise your hand against God's anointed. You see that repeatedly in David's early campaign against Saul. Okay? Saul is God's anointed. He's a bad king. He shouldn't be succeeded by his children, but he is God's anointed, and you don't raise your hand against him. To cope with this, David engages in what could be called a southern strategy. He goes into exile in Judah. This map was created for a different reason, but the red here, or part of the red here, can illustrate where Judah is located. Its capital at that time became, or Hebron became its capital at that time. And David in Judah, sometimes referred to as being in exile, but I don't think that's an accurate term, in refuge maybe, consolidated his position in Hebron, where he had himself anointed as king in Judah, where Saul had no real power base. This was not a direct challenge to Saul. And then he moved gradually into the borderlands, going to the north. He reigned as king in Judah for 7 years while in refuge. Saul remains a threat while he lives. David does not regard his descendants as a threat. So he deals carefully and strategically with Saul during Saul's lifetime. Then he deals more aggressively after Saul dies. He moves farther north and he is anointed king again, and this time he's anointed king even before he establishes a real jurisdiction, with a wider claim to be king of Israel. He establishes then a structure of a new monarchy over all of Israel. And I want to look first at his secular policies and his accomplishments. The first of them is his creation of a new capital, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an interesting choice, and again, we've got a real rough analogy to the American experience. It's not halfway exactly, but more or less between two regions, north and south. It has no established Israelite traditions. Okay? It's more than the swampland at Foggy Bottom, but it is not a prominent Israelite city. It is a Jebusite city. Who are the Jebusites? They're a Semitic people, but not part of traditional Israel to start with. Okay? They are incorporated into it by David through rather clever policy. But he takes the Jebusite city, which in a way could be considered a power vacuum, that's located with no traditional tribal affiliation. And he turns this, like Washington, D.C., into his new capital.
Hey, Doug?
Yo.
At what point do you think people associated the Temple Mount with Mount Moriah?
I don't know, you tell me.
No, I don't know.
No, I don't.
But at some point, those traditions became conflated.
Yes.
I don't know if it was always identified as that.
Well, of course, in David's reign, you know, the whole idea of the Temple Mount becomes much more important in Solomon's time.
Well, of course, that's one of the keys to, as you'll say later, his, his politics.
But in David's period, as you were describing, the walk you took from the city of David, what was traditionally seen as the city of David wasn't on the Temple Mount. Right,
but the Temple Mount, if it was associated from ancient times with the sacrifice of Isaac,
clearly it was.
Yeah, then it has other strategic value than just being a Jebusite city that's between north and south.
I don't believe
It
that
has
was.
cultic. It has
I don't
cultic.
believe, yeah, but I don't believe it has. I don't believe, I'm not 100% sure, that under the Jebusites it had that kind of status at all.
Right, and that's, but at some point,
Yes.
it has this high cultic value.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just
And we'll
David's,
deal with that in a preliminary way later today and much more when we get
it's not
to
just David's creation.
Well, what's not David's creation?
That cultic value.
No, no.
It's something that
We'll
he may exploit.
deal with that again in a few minutes, but yes.
But it's critical, I think, to recognize.
I think it
has
is indeed.
this pre-existent value.
Okay, one of the first things David does as king is to conduct a census.
Yeah.
And this is very controversial. Why is this controversial? Who else conducted a census shortly after becoming king, after sort of establishing a new realm in a new place? William the Conqueror. The Domesday Book was in most ways a census.
And Pharaoh, probably.
Who owned property where, who controlled property where. It was a census. Why does David conduct a census? To provide employment for unemployed professionals in temporary work at $8 an hour. Why would he conduct a census? As a first act, and a controversial one. What does the census?
How many people are in each tribe?
Matter of curiosity, but not primary concern.
Get more land.
He wanted to know who the stakeholders were. He wanted to know who the stakeholders were.
Yes.
Who was in power.
But for what purpose?
So he can tax them.
Number one, taxation. The census is a basis for a rational system of taxation, which didn't exist in the tribal
and conscription.
And conscription. Okay? Build up the fiscal basis for your bureaucracy and build up a professional military with its loyalty to you. And those people who were Eurosceptics, those people who were king skeptics, saw that danger in the census, and it was controversial at the time. But he carried it through and it prevailed and it accomplished its goals. He then created the bureaucratic institutions for civil administration. I'll let that phrase stand for itself. You have in your mind what that sort of means. But he created a bureaucracy serving the needs of his new state.
It means property values in Jerusalem went way up.
Property values in parts of Jerusalem at least went way up, and then Solomon gave a boost to it in other areas. He conciliated the Canaanite and other minorities in the area where he established his authority. He made appointments of minorities, and most notably appointments of Jebusites. He co-opted the Jebusites after establishing his authority. The Jebusites became his allies, and he appointed them to positions of responsibility. And some of his leading generals were not Israelites. They were from Canaanite minorities or they were Jebusites. One of them we'll encounter in a few minutes, if I ever get there, was Uriah the Hittite, the husband of Bathsheba, whom David contrived to have dispatched, but who initially was a responsible asset to David as a military commander. He expanded the territory through conquest and through diplomacy. He played off a bunch of small bordering states against each other. He contained the Philistine threat. And in the end, he directly ruled a kingdom sort of like this one that I've grown up for different reasons, which, if you'll look at it and think of a contemporary map, occupied an area roughly the size and extent of the current state of Israel. Solomon expanded it beyond those borders, but then lost it again. He makes alliances with neighbors that he doesn't incorporate. And the most important of them was Hiram, the king of Tyre, and Sidon up on the coast. Okay? He's more famous later for his contributions to Solomon's construction of the temple in Jerusalem. But in fact, he was also responsible for aiding the construction, aiding trade between Israel and the coast. Because this is a port, and Israel is landlocked. But also in cooperating in the construction of David's palace. He then creates, after establishing a secular bureaucratic foundation for the new state in Jerusalem, he creates a dynastic ideology, thing known as the Davidic Covenant. This is something that he does in connection with his court chaplain, Nathan. They interpret dreams and they conclude what the proper role of the Davidic king is going to be. As a concession to people who were monarchical skeptics, the Davidic Covenant contained the provision that the king was not above the law. He was responsible for the law, okay? And he could be chastised for his violations of the law. But the dynasty had an inalienable right to rule. The king could be punished, and as collateral damage, the people could be punished. But there would never fail, according to the Davidic Covenant, on the throne of Israel, a descendant of the house of David. And this, up through the period of exile, is a real consideration. And then it becomes more of a symbolic consideration that gets involved in the whole idea of the Messianic hope. But there shall never fail to be on the throne of the house of Israel a descendant of the house of David. This is, in borrowing a Chinese phrase, this is a mandate of heaven. And the covenant remains in force as a practical matter through the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, and then progressively is reinterpreted as what you could call the Messianic hope. Okay.
So, Doug, can I ask?
Yes, please do.
You say David created that. It could be thought that that was established at the time of Josiah or later.
No, the Davidic Covenant, I think, is clearly David. That's spelled out in both his words and in Nathan's words.
In the book of Samuel.
Yeah.
And so then we have to have some idea of when the book of Samuel was written.
Yeah, but it's observed during the Davidic period.
Well, so all I'm getting at is that presumes.
All I'm getting at is 2 sessions from now we'll do Josiah.
No, but then
re-raise the question.
That's enough in the message.
No, it presumes that the text that you're basing the observation on is contemporary with the events. And
yeah, but we're dealing here. Yeah, I mean that's always a valid.
There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the text comes much later.
Yeah, the text probably comes later.
And involves a lot of theologizing.
Yeah, but yes, and it does. But what we got to remember is that David is a prominent public figure with a public record. And so you can't get too far from that public record when you're talking about the ideology.
So all that's very debatable based on the archaeological record. That is that the question being, is David recognizable as a public figure beyond the text?
There are some people who are real David skeptics, who doubt that he really had a capital in Jerusalem.
Right.
That this whole thing is a subsequent
It's a creation of the text.
Well, it's also a creation of the Zionists in the critics' minds. Right. Yeah, but I got to kind of gloss over that, I think, to get to the end.
As long as we nod.
Yeah. In addition to creating this dynastic ideology, parallel to developing the secular policies that he develops, that we talked about already, he develops the center of a religious cult in Jerusalem. Okay. And I'm talking here again about the biblical narrative. Right. He brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, which had previously been sort of an itinerant relic in various locations. And there's an elaborate account of the parade in which the Ark is ceremonially brought into Jerusalem in a formal procession. And when I talk about families, I'm going to talk a little bit about someone who was critical of his actions, dancing before the Ark. He builds a tabernacle as a temporary home for the Ark. And the tabernacle is sometimes called the tent of meeting. It's, in retrospect, perhaps a prototype for the future temple. And there are people in later times who even try to work out the proportions and dimension to show that the temple was actually patterned on the tabernacle. Maybe. It is a prototype for the future temple. It is a home for the Ark of the Covenant. The temple is something, according to the biblical narrative, that David is not permitted to build because of his sins. The idea you can chastise him for his shortcomings, but you don't remove his mandate. It is not primarily a center for corporate worship. It is not like the temple becomes a unique place of sacrifice. It's kind of a ceremonial gathering place for the tribes. This parallel religious cult reinforces the secular institutions, reinforces the situation of Jerusalem as the new capital. It has a practical purpose, therefore. But I don't think we should think of it as simply a policy of expediency. There is a lot to point to the fact that after his own lights, at least, David is a genuinely religious person, has religious experiences, and his ecstatic dance when the Ark is brought into Jerusalem probably reflects a genuine part of his character. Okay, throughout David's reign, we've talked here about secular institutions, religious institutions, the dynastic ideology. David brings with him, or is plagued by, family problems, which cast shadows over his achievements and create difficulties for him. Polygamy, whether it's serial or otherwise, may be a personal ethical problem for private citizens. But polygamy is an affair of state when you're dealing with the king. It affects public policy. Biblical accounts identify by name 7 marriages that David enters into while he's king in Hebron, and 1 more, Bathsheba, after he moves to Jerusalem. But elsewhere, there are suggestions that that's a great undercount, that he was actually married or had wives, legal wives, that went beyond the number 8. Childless marriages, some scholars believe, were not deemed worth enumerating in the biblical accounts. Little is known about most of his wives, but 2 are problematic, though in very different ways. The first of them is Saul's daughter, Michal, who is recorded as, from her point of view, a love match with David. David marries her probably for political reasons. She's Saul's daughter, and that marriage occurs before his definitive break with Saul. But from her point of view, I was amused to see that the commentators are amused, I don't know, informed to see that the commentators say that it is the only actual love match accounted in the Old Testament. Can't prove it by me. People who've looked into those things believe that's so. But from David's point of view, it wasn't. And there's a tension created between the way Michal looks at David and the way he looks at her. When David breaks with Saul, Saul removes her, she's his daughter, from David's custody, and he marries her to another man. This continues to be the case while David is an opposition figure in Hebrew. After Saul dies and David is moving north, he reclaims her, and she was his first wife. He reclaims her and dispossesses her then current husband, which is probably bad form. And her then current husband comes to the court and pleads for David to give her back because they're in love. And David says, screw you, I'm the king. So you get a situation where their marriage resumes, but with certain tensions. And when David comes into Jerusalem dancing before the ark, Michal ridicules his religiosity. She is an Israelite after a fashion. Saul is her father, but she's not a religious person, and she flirts with other foreign religious sects. And she thinks that David is behaving like a damn fool to be dancing before the ark. And she tells him so, and she tells onlookers the same. And this friction remains in one form or another until she dies. Bathsheba is quite a different matter, despite the complicated courtship. She becomes, and the episode with or without a bathtub, she becomes the love of David's life. She really does. And in the end, despite the controversial beginning, she becomes a decided asset to the dynasty. She complicates his reign because she meddles in a lot of the succession questions until she actually finds the proper solution. She selects her son as Solomon as the most legitimate of the successors, and she endorses him after David's death formally and ensures his succession, something we'll talk about when we look at Solomon next time. Two of David's sons launched rebellions, Absalom and Adonijah. Absalom sort of in the middle of David's reign. Absalom was David's favorite son, but he puts himself in an untenable position, and in the end, David reluctantly engineers Absalom's death. Adonijah is at the end of David's reign. His rebellion, he's by another mother, is not clearly ended actually until David dies, but is in its waning stages. Nathan, David's chaplain, court chaplain, regards these two rebellions of his son as part of God's curse on David for his transgressions. You're not removing the authority of the house of David, but you are punishing David's family, his immediate family, for his bad behavior in the matter of Bathsheba, which Nathan never really comes to terms. I'm going to leave it there, I think, for now, and pick up the succession question when next time I deal with Saul. Oh, let's go for posterity.
Yes, certainly.
And I'll get the autographed copy.
Yes, you will. Say hi to Greg and Janet.
Yeah. I will deal until,
Yes, sir.
until second call sits in order. I'll do any questions.
I talked to it. I got it right